my name's Peter McMillan, the Chief Executive Officer at NT Shelter. I'd like to acknowledge the Larrakia people, the traditional owners of the land in which we're broadcasting from today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to any other First Nations people who might be watching on or listening to this podcast. Welcome. Today we've got another great episode of Sharing the Couch, and I'm delighted to be able to say that we're having a conversation with a gentleman over in Ireland. It's great to travel all that way overseas and to learn and understand a little bit more about the housing challenges in our other countries, our friends and allies over in Ireland, and really looking forward to learning a bit more about the housing system and what they're trying to do over there. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Rob Lowth. Rob is the National Director of the Housing First National Office at the Housing Agency in the Republic of Ireland. Rob is based in Dublin. Before taking on this role, he was working at Limerick City Council as Head of Homelessness Services. His career has been in the local government space since 2003, including working as a housing maintenance manager. Rob holds qualifications in computer systems and programming and has a BA in management from the Institute of Public Administration. A very warm welcome from Darwin over to you in Dublin, I'm assuming. Rob, and good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Peter. I'm actually in East Clare, would you believe, on the west coast, on the River Shannon. So a little bit different, remotely working today.
Wonderful. And for those of us, including me, I guess, who are just trying to picture where that beautiful part of the world no doubt is it near Galway or somewhere over near Cork?
Yeah, it's south of Galway. It's kind of north of Limerick City. The nearest town is a beautiful town called Killaloe in County Clare, right on the bottom of Lough Derg, if anyone fancies a visit to this beautiful part of the world.
It sounds lovely. You know, if I had the means, I'll be on a plane tomorrow, Rob, but, you know, we can always look forward to some other stage. I'll have to see if I can find a good reason to get over there and understand the Irish housing system a little bit better.
Definitely, great opportunity.
But for today, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program and to speak for you from afar. And I noticed that you work for the housing agency and you've got some writing there. Is that in Gaelic, or how would you describe that language you have there?
Yeah, it would Gaelic. So the primary language of Ireland would be Gaeilge, as they would say it here. So it's a little like in Wales, for example, promoting the primary language. So it's very important to us. Not all of us speak it very well, but it's important to recognize our heritage and where we've come from as well. And then with every state agency, the harp is the symbol of Ireland, and that was adopted in our independence just over 100 years ago now. So equally as important to people in the public service, that when the harp is on your logo, it's a national symbol. It's a beacon, I suppose, to some extent for the country as well.
Absolutely. And Rob, just while we're talking about that, in terms of the harp, obviously Ireland is a very musical nation, very lyrical nation, I guess, as well. What does harp symbolise for Irish culture?
I suppose it's the traditions and the historical aspect of Irish traditional music, and it's from the fiddle to the harp. The bodhrán would be another drum instrument that would be very traditional to Ireland. So it's and not dissimilar to some of the traditional instruments in Australia as well. So yeah, but important symbolism.
Absolutely, no, that's really really special. Now, I guess in terms of your background, I mentioned in the introduction that you were working in Limerick, not far from where you are today, by the sound of things, and you've done some work originally in computer systems and programming. It's quite a way away from housing. Do you want to tell us a bit about your journey there?
Yeah, I suppose I originally in college, when I finished in school, I fancied the IT sector and computer programming. I had an interest there, and I worked while in Dublin. I worked for a number of top companies. Would have had employment with Microsoft, Corel, which was a graphics company that was subsequently taken over by Microsoft. And then I moved to Limerick, and I was working for Dell Computers. But again, I don't know whether it was a burning desire for change or I was tired of making money for the man. But I kind of felt my life was away from the IT sector. And I suppose I'd built up a lot of skill as a people and project manager. And that's where I saw a job with the local authority and said I could do that. And it was effectively managing homeless services. And it was about bringing the project management and the people skills and porting them into that space. And that was back in 2003. And I haven't looked back since. I had a really good grounding in a local authority, learned so much about the housing system. And I was working with Limerick in different guises through the housing department until March of last year in 2022, when I took on the role within the housing agency to head up the new Housing First National Office, which it is a project that I would have been involved in while working in the local authority. And I was very invested in because it was, I suppose, Housing First was seen as the beacon, the solution for long-term homelessness, the real solution for housing people that we'd never been able to successfully house before. And at the end of the day, that's effectively what we kind of got into. So yeah, sorry, go on, Peter.
No, so that's fantastic. So with a strong background in data and in systems, you're able to transport that across into the housing homelessness space, and also, I guess, using those skills and those programs to make a difference in terms of, I guess, people that you can make that strong connection to. It's interesting, isn't it? I think a lot of us who work in housing and homelessness, who have worked in other industries before, and myself included, it's nice. I haven't worked for Microsoft or Dell or those sorts of companies, but coming across into this sector, you really do feel you can bring that experience across and make a difference in a sector where you can see the results for your work.
Yeah. No, skills are transferable. There's no question. I did have a lot to learn. I had to slow down coming into local government because my ideas were fast paced and maybe a little too fast for local government at the time. But I worked with a really good NGO sector that would have been delivering services for the local authority. And that was important to educate me on the human side of what was actually going on the ground. And then I suppose I'm the type of person that I like to get my boots on the ground and get out there and meet tenants, meet people who are in homeless facilities as well, to actually understand and hear where they're coming from. Because I think so much of policy often gets dictated without actually translating, well, what does somebody actually require?
Given that strong background in programming and the like, did that also enable you to come with a strong, I guess, preference for data and evidence to be able to do the work that you do?
Yeah, it was important. Definitely, it was important to be able to back up, and it made life a little easier when it came to writing things like business cases to develop new services. And I suppose in the Midwest, we had a bit of a reputation for developing really good services, and worked with some really good personalities in the NGO sector, within the health sector. And those partnerships were really important to delivery. And I think I learned that at a really early stage in local government, that you achieve nothing alone. You have to work in partnership, and you have to make sure your partners are with you and invested with you as well.
Absolutely. But also, just following on from that, I guess, in terms of those partnerships, those collaborations, all important, as you say. What is the state of, how would you rate the state of data in Ireland around, I guess, measurement of outcomes, and also having that supporting evidence base you need to evaluate programs and to push for more programs and services?
Yeah, we completed a really good evaluation, partnered with the University of Limerick, ironically, on the National Housing First system. And that was focused, unfortunately, it was focused a lot during COVID. So that didn't help the connection, but we still were able to gather the data and deliver a really good evaluation. And that is I suppose, as you said, the important side of any program is having good data to be able to evaluate it in the right way. And ultimately, the new implementation plan on Housing First that we're working to at the moment is a large part the result of findings from the evaluation, so that it's not just data on a shelf. It's data that's been taken and used to kick on and make the project even more successful in the future. And equally from that, we've developed a quarterly monitoring system with all the regions in the country, so that we're continuously taking data and continuously seeing, well, where are the blockages, where are the needs for more resources, and that's both from a housing support perspective and a clinical perspective as well.
Rob, I'd like to just mention a couple of terms just for our audience who might not be familiar with the different authorities and players in the housing space over there, the participants and their roles. Just before we get into the nitty-gritty of the work that that you do as National Director of the Housing First National Office and the Housing Agency, just some of the other bodies over there. So you've got the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. I'm assuming that's like part of the Irish government, Republic of Ireland government.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be the main housing department from the Minister for Housing.
At a national level. And then you've got local authorities. What are they?
Yeah, so you've got 31 local authorities around the country. Dublin, being the largest population base, would be split into 4 local authorities. But from a homeless perspective, there's one operating department that covers all 4 local authorities, which was really important to try and coordinate such a large population base, and obviously the largest homeless side of things. But then around the country, you're typically geographically mixed between the natural county boundaries to deliver services as well. And there's been a lot of reform in local government in Ireland over the last 20 years, where we've reduced the number of local authorities in an effort to be more efficient, and try to enhance local government as well by having more of a public engagement and an elected representative engagement as well. And I think that's been really important because, again, like any project, you got to connect with the people, and your elected members are that link for local authorities as well. So each local authority would have local representatives based of the various parties, that would equally then the national politics feeds in, or the local government feeds into the national system in terms of the Houses of Parliament, and the bigger scale of things. But everything usually starts on a local level, to feed in then to the national politicians as well.
So it sounds like in Ireland you have like those local authorities similar to our local government or local councils, local government areas. What's probably different is we have state and territory governments. You probably don't have those. I'm assuming in Ireland. Do the local authorities have income from ratepayers and taxpayers, or is that all passed out from the federal government to them?
Yeah, it's a very much central government system in Ireland. There are ratepayers within the local authority areas, and that feeds the majority of the local government budget. But the part of the local government budget, but central grants from central government, be it Department of Housing, Department of Transport when it comes to roads, they typically feed local authorities the bread and butter aspect of the finance. So while that is probably seen as a negative in the sense that local areas aren't self-sufficient in how they actually deliver, so that there's no local sales tax, for example, like you would have in other jurisdictions. That's all centrally collected. But there is, in the last number of years, there has been an introduction of a local property tax, which has given more control to elected members because they can vote on a percentage change in any given year, which has devolved an amount of power to local government. And that is happening slowly but surely. There is more devolution of powers from central government to local government. And for example, Limerick, again, ironically, maybe I'm biased, but as a progressive local authority, voted to have a directly elected mayor, which is something that's a new departure for Ireland. Even Dublin doesn't have that. And that's expected to happen next year. So it's, I suppose, expected to have a directly elected mayor with a substantial budget, staffing to be able to enhance the city and the county of Limerick in a different way. And it's going to be looked at broadly in terms of a pilot system to see how that system actually works out. So it's kind of exciting as well when you see that kind of thing happening.
Absolutely. So in terms of a responsibility for the provision of, I guess, last resort housing, so we call that, in Australia, we call that public housing, that where it's housing that's provided for the lowest income earning tenants. And if it's run by non-government organisations, we call them community housing providers, similar to CHOs, I think, in the UK, housing associations. I'm assuming in Ireland that's the role of approved housing bodies. Is that right? AHBs?
That AHBs, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. So who's responsible in Ireland at the end of the day for ensuring that people who are homeless or don't have access to affordable housing get housing? Is it the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, or do local governments also have a part to play, like the local authorities?
Yeah, it's very much the local authorities. So that's I suppose it's a legislative part of the 1988 Housing Act that devolved that power to local government to be in the position to say, well, if somebody presents homeless, that you must provide housing for them. And there's obviously stipulations within that as to what meets the criteria, but it's quite broad as well. So that power and that responsibility is there for local government. Typically, it's a contracted service then with your community service providers or your AHBs. And in Ireland, the approved housing bodies, they're very much split into those who focus on social housing and those who focus on homeless services. So but they're funded, and the mechanisms to fund them are pretty much the same in terms of the housing they actually deliver. But the homeless organizations, for me, and they go that extra mile. They have a completely different ethos, and they would be involved in maybe some more fundraising than the larger AHBs as well. They wouldn't have fundraising managers, for example. They'd be more focused on delivering just raw social housing at mass, where the smaller homeless providers are very niche in terms of the skill sets that they actually have to deliver the services to deal with complex individuals.
Okay, so roughly what will the split be between, say, social housing that's owned by local authorities versus that's run by AHB? Sort of be 50-50 or more the local authorities?
I would say the existing housing that's in the public system at the moment would be more 60-40 to local government, to AHBs. And that's purely because historically housing was delivered by local government. But in more recent years, the AHB sector have been delivering much more in terms of a 50-50 split, and in some years have been delivering more than local government as well. So I definitely see the space opening up more for approved housing bodies. And the balance, I think, is going to be eventually 50-50. And then you would wonder into the future, are local government actually going to be delivering housing at all? Because it is becoming such a specialist niche market. And at times, approved housing bodies are proven that they can maybe deliver a little bit faster as well. And that, again, can come down to bureaucratic red tape at the same time.
Yeah, we're certainly having those discussions here in Australia at the moment in terms of the advantages that non-government organisations, that are registered community housing providers, can bring to the table, and there's certainly a lot of those advantages that you've just mentioned. I'm curious as to the general state of play, Rob, in terms of housing and homelessness, how you'd sum that up in terms of Ireland. I'm just curious that when I was, I guess, preparing for this conversation, I saw the Irish government has signed the Lisbon declaration on ending homelessness by 2030. So I was just curious as to what that involves. What's the state of play, and what does that commitment involve?
Yeah, I suppose it is what it says on the tin in terms of the Minister for Housing is quite vocal about it as well. And he is, I genuinely believe, committed to ending long-term homelessness. And his support for projects like Housing First have been to the fore in terms of that. But I suppose the state of play in terms of the high levels of both family homelessness and single homelessness is just, I suppose it's a consequence in the sense of the housing crisis and the demand for housing across the board. I think the financial crash has had such an impact on the housing market that when no new housing was being built at the time, and that slowed down, and that gap between ramping up to deliver more public housing, I think that has just made I think worldwide, it's not just in Ireland, I think that is the problem where a number of countries are facing housing crisis at the moment. And homelessness is at record levels across Europe, certainly, without going further afield. So it is the picture. We're delivering more social housing than we ever have at the moment, but the numbers continue to rise in the sense that you had a lot of people dependent on the private rented market, which they were maybe entitled to a housing support, for example. If they weren't able to get social housing, they would get a payment so that they could pay their landlord. But what's happening is landlords are getting out of that market because they're finding it tougher and tougher. So you're seeing a drop in the private market rental space because no new properties are actually being delivered into that space because the price of housing is so high. So the return on investment isn't lucrative for anybody new coming into that market. So that then leaves the responsibility solely on the public system between local authorities and approved housing bodies as well.
What does homelessness in Ireland look like? Would you have a lot of overcrowding in housing, or would you have a lot of rough sleeping or couch surfing, as we say?
Yeah, you will have, and I suppose couch surfing isn't typically measured in the homelessness figures in Ireland. And I know it is in certain countries, and I think that's where we all tend to count homelessness a little bit different. But the general homelessness figure is creeping up on about 13,000 at the moment. The vast majority of that is families, but at least with family accommodation, it's a little bit easier to actually move through the system. It's the single homelessness and accessibility to one-bed properties, for example, isn't something that Ireland was delivering over the last number of years or historically. It's just not been there. So it's proving a difficult point. You mentioned rough sleeping there. Rough sleeping has actually improved in the sense that in Dublin, for example, long-term rough sleepers have benefited hugely from the Housing First programme. And they're the people that have been targeted. And these people, they deserve it in the sense that they meet the fidelity of Housing First in terms of being long-term rough sleeping or have a history of being in emergency accommodation as well and have multiple complex issues. So that has been the real win for Housing First, for example, in terms of reducing that long-term rough sleeping. And it's, while Dublin was the highest proportion nationally of rough sleeping, there were pockets of it in the larger cities like Limerick, Galway, Cork and Waterford. And equally, Housing First is having an impact in those areas as well.
And I'm going to get to Housing First very, very soon, I can promise. But I just had a couple other things that were interesting that occurred as well. And one was the fact that you have a lot of vacant properties in Ireland. And I was just curious about that. Why do you have so many vacant properties?
Yeah, I suppose vacancy and dereliction kind of go hand in hand. And again, a lot of that vacancy is in rural areas, for example, where somebody may have been left a property historically. they never had the money to actually invest or do anything to it themselves, and they had no interest. It may have been sentimental, it may have been a family property. So that is, by and by, that is part of where we've gotten to. And I think the housing crisis opened up a different eye looking at derelict properties. So that's one aspect of it. Then you have small towns, and even in large cities, you have a lot of derelict commercial properties that started coming up on the market, that were, I'm sure Australia is the same. The advent of people shopping online moved away from the need for commercial properties. So we have actually been really good in Ireland at changing and turning a lot of that derelict property into social housing as well. And it's giving a regeneration, for want of a better description, to a lot of small towns and villages where it's an eyesore. In the past, it was an eyesore to drive down the main thoroughfare of a small village, whereas now there's been a lot of really good grant schemes available, with interest-free loans, for example, delivered by local authorities to people who own these properties. And then they could lease those properties to local authorities for a reasonable return on rent. And it means that it's not going to be compulsory purchased, and that it's actually delivering a social housing need within a town as well. So there have been blights, and there have been good examples in terms of where we've been able to work and turn things around as well.
Yeah, I really like that example of the turning that commercial property into social housing, working with local commercial operators and repurposing. That's the best of community collaboration, isn't it? When you've got such a housing need as well. Also, I guess it must be a tough situation in Ireland for renters as well. I noticed that there's a limited rent increases to general inflation over there. Is there a bit of a rental crisis? There's just not enough places to rent in the private market.
Ultimately, it is, and it's having an impact. The rent pressure zones have been really good in the last number of years in terms of trying to control the rent. But again, it's just doesn't seem to be enough in terms of the lack of properties on the market. And that possibly is one of the reasons why a lot of landlords may be leaving the market as well, is that they're limited in terms of how much they can increase their rents as well. So from that perspective, while you're trying to do good, there's always an opposite effect that may go with a rent pressure zone correction as well. But I think controlling, when things started to get out of control, certainly in Dublin it started, it was a good point to actually bring it in to the system. But a lot of it was focused in the larger cities as well. But when you confine a rent pressure zone to one part of an area or a county, typically what happens is the population spill outside that zone then to try and find the property as well. So I think there have been really good lessons learned in terms of that, trying to control the actual rents within the country. But it's certainly the lack of available rental properties that has driven the rent increase ultimately within Ireland.
That's something that needs to be treated with caution, isn't it? How you implement those things. Make sure you know the implications. Just like to turn now then to the housing agency and your part in that as National Director of the Housing First National Office. Rob, can you tell us a bit about the housing agency, the work that you do there, and specifically then the work that you do as the Housing First National Office?
Yeah. I suppose the housing agency is a sub-department of the Department of Housing. And it's a vehicle that sits between the Department of Housing and the local authorities. So from that perspective, it's a centre of knowledge. And if the Department of Housing have new schemes that they wish to run and roll out, the vehicle is usually the housing agency as the first point of contact. So ultimately, the housing agency, while running schemes, has to be a centre of knowledge for all things housing within the country. And in the last number of years, the roles that the housing agency have actually taken on are so wide and diverse, from managing defective concrete block schemes, for example, working with homelessness on housing, a project like Housing First, and setting up the National Housing First office within the agency is, I think they're the best two examples I can give as to how far you can get apart. But it's it's a really progressive agency as well, in the sense that it's always, how can we help? How can we do more? And I suppose that's to try and be a bit of a lifeline for local authorities as well, because as government introduce new schemes, they become resource intensive as well. And we're all very conscious that resources worldwide are seemingly becoming scarce, and skilled resources even more so. And that is an issue, and that we all need to be mindful of, that when you ask for more, you have to realize, well, who's actually going to deliver the more? And I think the agency have been really good to be that support for local authorities, and trying to take up a bit of the legwork, for want of a better description, to take pressure off local authorities as well. So I think sorry, yeah.
No, I was going to say, it sounds like a really important bridge between the local authorities and the department. And I was just noticed some of the skill sets and experience that the agency has just listed here. Includes housing policy expertise, researchers, architects, engineers, project managers and planners, and building the capacity in the sector through education and information. So there's a lot of valuable work that's done there in terms of I guess design, delivery, the whole box and dice.
Yeah, the whole kit and caboodle, as they would say over here. But it's and even when you mentioned some of that area there, I suppose I'm in a service inclusion department, and again, we're very much aligned with just the raw housing delivery within local government. And when I say housing delivery, it's not even the physical side of it. It's about projects like we had talked earlier about grants for older people, grants for people with disabilities, disabled person strategies, for example. That's been really important, and trying to drive the idea of being more inclusive, and trying to drive the properties need to be kitted out at an earlier stage for dealing with different parts of someone's life as well. And I suppose then the whole homelessness area that we've become involved in, Housing First is one part. But again, we've started doing a lot of work on things like the youth homeless strategy that was rolled out by the Department of Housing as well last year. And trying to kind of drive that, because when you look at a rental market that's oversaturated, young people are the first ones to actually miss out, because they've been discriminated on because you're just too young, income grounds, and then experience. They don't have experience of private rented sector housing, so no one's going to give them a chance. So there's been more and more emphasis on that, and then preventing people, young people, from actually becoming homeless at the same time, which is more important, because I suppose it's something that the government have been driving, is that prevention is the first port of call in everything. Because if you stop it happening in the first place, you're saving the individual the trauma of becoming homeless then later on, and you're actually been more cost effective in your investment as well.
Absolutely. What is roughly by tenure, what is the breakdown in terms of renting on versus home ownership? Would it be 20-30% renting, or would it be more than that? I mean, is there a huge proportion?
I would say, yeah, it's probably about 30%. And I wonder, is that actually increasing in more recent years as well? Home ownership has definitely, home ownership was very much the target for everybody in Ireland. And it probably still is in so many different ways. But just because of the cost and then the high rental costs, just people aren't in the space to be able to save the way they may have in the past, because they're paying so much in rent. And I mean, 30% is the typical, I suppose, the mark of how much income you want to spend on your rental outlay. And that's getting higher and higher. So that just means that people have less disposable income to actually save to buy property into the future.
And in our country.
Yeah, and that's where we've grown into the affordable housing space more and more. which I think is really important because, and that's maybe where we missed a trick in Ireland, in the sense that when we started getting into pressure points, we may have started looking at affordable housing a little bit too late, but we're moving in that space now, and we've made some really, really good progress in the affordable housing space. But again, it's an area that needs more and more, because you have young families, single people who have really good incomes, but they just don't have the opportunity to be able to buy where they want to buy as well. Choice becomes a part of that. So, but I've seen some really good kind of partnerships between local authorities and approved housing bodies in delivering affordable housing as well. And then looking at affordable cost rental properties is something else that's been worked on at the moment, which is where the rent is guaranteed to be at a lower amount, which means that individuals could then have a bit of space to save for the future as well.
And who meets that subsidy gap, I guess, that difference between market price and affordable?
Ultimately, that's from grants from central government in terms of making the build more cost effective for the approved housing body or the local authority. So that's when you look at the economics of housing, you need to be very mindful as to, well, how far do you go to interfere in the housing market as well? And that's a really tough tightrope for any government to actually walk, regardless of the pressures and regardless of opposition parties and the noise that's in the housing space. You really, and it's like the rent pressure zones that we talked about earlier as well. If you make a decision in a market, you have to be very aware as to what the reaction might be in the market as well.
Absolutely. And I guess in Australia, where we're now talking about either voluntary or mandatory inclusionary zoning, where we set aside a proportion of new land that's released and for subdivision, maybe having 20% of it for social and affordable housing and the rest at market. Just understanding the implications and the impacts, the whole way price responds, and it's very important to, I guess, you have that consultation and make sure the vision's clear and it's properly priced as well.
Yeah. We'd have similar kind of parts in Ireland around that 20%. But what's happening is that you're dependent on the private market to deliver that mix as well. And because the private market aren't building as much or investing as much, there's a real slowdown in terms of any transfers to deliver extra properties there as well.
So very interesting. So let's talk about housing first, which is your remit, Rob. And my understanding is you've been in this role for around a year, or a little bit over a year now.
Yeah, just over a year. March, I took up the role March of last year. Yeah.
Wonderful. So from your perspective, can you just tell us what Housing First means to you a little bit about how it's come about in Ireland and where it's heading from here?
Yeah, I suppose maybe just the historical sense of it. Originally, Housing First kind of started in Ireland as a pilot in Dublin on a really small scale, and it was the thought of housing the most vulnerable, the most chaotic, but ultimately housing the individuals who'd never had an opportunity to properly sustain a tenancy ever before. So, excuse me, I suppose from the Dublin perspective, it actually worked out really successful, and it started to gain traction in terms of the housing aspect of it. But I suppose Housing First is so codependent, and this is even working in a local authority delivering Housing First. It's only in the last year that I've really started to see the importance of housing and health. So it's the early days of the pilot in Dublin. The health aspect was a little bit slower to come on board in the sense that dedicated resources had to be made available. But it was happening. The housing was happening. There were supports with existing health services within the community, and there was a wraparound support being delivered to the individuals. And I suppose as it kicked on then in 2018, there was a pilot, and I suppose it was a pilot that was directed around change and change management. And there was a a really good organization called Genio in Ireland who focus on service reform. And they were kind of the initial project managers at the time. And they were bringing philanthropy money in with government money to drive it across a couple of cities, namely in Cork, Limerick, Waterford, and eventually into Galway as well. And I suppose that's where the program and the evaluation was actually carried out as well. So as Housing First developed, specialist health roles were actually funded within health service areas, side by side with the housing teams that were contracted out to NGOs. So you didn't equally have one NGO delivering all the Housing First services across the country. It was a spread, it was a tender, and it was a spread between the various different NGOs that had the skill set in the country. So I suppose in terms of the collaboration and where we started to deliver housing, and where it really made an impact for me, and I can give you this real example from Limerick. There was an unfortunate lady who I had known for many years, had been homeless in the city, had a multitude of different issues, but had never received an official diagnosis because she actually never got to sit in front of anybody for any period of time because of her addiction issues and because of her mental health issues ultimately. She was street working. She was involved in a whole load of other different things as well, and was just very vulnerable. Would sleep rough for long periods of time, would never be comfortable living in emergency accommodation either. So when we actually developed Housing First in Limerick at the time, I made it my business to make sure that she was the first tenant. A lot of people looked at me and said, well, she doesn't have a diagnosis, she doesn't have this, she doesn't have that. And I said, what are we actually trying to deliver here? Housing First is about removing these barriers and removing the red tape that blocked individuals like this from being housed. So that was 2018. I stuck to my guns. She was the first tenant, and touch wood, to this day, she's now living really happily. She's rekindled with a partner. She's reduced her addiction in terms of she stopped drinking. She's addressed health issues. She's now engaged in mental health services. I'm the psychologist who's primarily involved in the team as well. And she's living a really good quality of life. Going on day trips are the highlight of her life at the moment. Doing a little bit of dancing with her partner, and she's supported and helped through by the team to get to different events. But she has a quality of life now that she never had. Probably in the 17 odd years that I would have known her since she first became homeless, how she survived is beyond me. But the fact that she's now housed and living a comfortable life is just testament to what actually can be delivered. But it's individuals like that who have never been given an opportunity, never been given a chance, that Housing First actually works for.
Rob,
where Housing First... Sorry.
Yeah. Rob, that's such a powerful, it's an incredible story, really, of the difference that housing can make. And that sums it up in a nutshell, doesn't it? No judgment, get the person into housing, give them that chance then to tackle their needs and provide the supports.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's not without its flaws either, in terms of we have some Housing First participants who are now on the third tenancy. But the beauty of Housing First is if a tenancy is failing, you don't punish them. You don't take them aside and say, well, you've been evicted now, so you go to the back of the list. They don't understand. And the responsibility is taken by the team to find a new property, to rehouse them, and then go back and look at, well, what was the issues? Where did we go wrong here? But try and address those issues as well with the tenant. It's not that you're just walking away from a problem. It's that you're trying to say, well, this is what happened. This is why we had to move you, and working with them on those things as well. And trying to unearth the trauma that somebody's actually suffering that makes them behave in certain ways. And I think a big part of homelessness, and when I worked directly in services and working with psychiatric nurses who were very much, well, I can't deal with that person until they deal with their addiction. And having an opportunity now to actually work with individuals who have an addiction, but work in a harm reduction way. And I think everybody's been educated from a health side to a housing side to actually understand that, okay, we can work with people in addictions and we can help them reduce their addictions and improve their quality of life and ultimately improve the outcomes. I mean, where we go, we meet with everybody in there's 9 regions in terms of homelessness in Ireland. So local authorities from a homeless perspective in different regions are clustered. So we're meeting with 9 regions on a quarterly basis where we have monitoring data and we hear the case studies like the one I've talked about there. But for me, the powerful side of it is we hear about the difficulties, we hear about the gaps and the blockages and what we need going forward. But we hear about the positives. We hear about individuals, and there was one guy in the Midlands in the country in a really rural area. And we had heard at one quarterly meeting, we heard some bad things about him in terms of he was pretty low. And in the next meeting, we heard, would that all change when we got him a job? And he's still involved in addiction, but he's in a harm reduction way, but he's able to function in employment and hold down a job as well, which something small like that to everybody else, but that's the beacon for a successful scheme as well, because that's where it kicks on to say, well, you know what, that positive example can be replicated around the country. And a big part of what we're trying to do from a national office perspective, and it's kind of an unusual project as well, in the sense that we are a national office. Again, we're sitting between departments and pulling different government departments together, not just Department of Housing, Department of Justice, Department of Health, Department of Social Welfare as well. So we're bringing all these different government departments together to help us on the journey. And that collaboration is key. And I think why it's actually partly successful as well is that it's had really good sponsorship from the top level of government, because they realize it is the rose in the thorns at the moment in terms of homelessness. And if it's successful, why not invest more and more into the project as well? Because then we're going to reduce that long-term homeless aspect. And it brings it back to your point about Lisbon. It's the real commitment to Lisbon is that the more we invest at the cold face of long-term rough sleeping, long-term homelessness for those who are chaotic and in complex needs. So that's a really big part of the collaboration and the drive.
I think also you mentioned that sometimes things don't always work out, or you might need to move tenancies or change the location. But I think the statistic I've seen coming out from your work is that around 86% of them are successful,
Yeah.
which is a pretty strong endorsement that the approach works.
Yeah, no, it is 86%. And while I suppose I don't try and drive that, I think that's a great result and that's a great output. It's not something we focus on trying to drive towards, because I think that takes away from the natural work that actually happens within the project. I mean, if somebody needs to be evicted for various reasons, then they need to be evicted. There's no two ways about that. It's not that people aren't held responsible for their actions as well. And that is a big part of it. And I think that was a big part of trying to explain to local authorities, because it's very alien to a local authority to say, well, we've had a few problems in this apartment or this flat, we got to move to a new flat. And I think there's been a lot of minds, and we still have a lot of minds to change as well. It's not necessarily the finished article, but that's part of the process as well.
And do you think that agencies such as health and criminal justice sector getting their engagement, do you think they also get to see the benefits for the reduced spending in their areas on people who are, is that a big factor as well?
And there's really good examples, and there's some good data that we've seen in a hospital in Cork, where some of the team actually studied participants, and they were able to go back and look at the data prior to being housed in Housing First, and I think it was based on 4 participants. So in the 3 years before Housing First and the 3 years after they'd actually been housed, and the emergency department admissions went from, I think it was 170 down to 4.
Wow.
So that, if that in any language is telling you this program works and it's taking valuable time away from emergency departments, there you go. And it's the same in the criminal justice space then as well. They're really keen to get involved because they struggle in terms of trying to rehouse people who've been in the criminal justice system because of the stigma that goes with it. But what we've actually seen is a lot of people who've been in complex homeless situations, they typically reoffend and reoffend, often to get a bit of respite themselves and to get a roof over their head in prison for the winter. But what we're actually seeing with Housing First is, again, it's giving people an opportunity, it's working with them, and it's stopping them from reoffending, which saves the community. And then in return, it's saving the prison service the need to actually deal with them.
Absolutely. Rob, I'm still struck by that story of the woman that you mentioned who you known for 18 years. An incredibly powerful story look on that. And I guess I'm just curious about the way in which Housing First needs to engage with neighbours and the local community, because I guess housing people with complex needs can sometimes, at least in Australia, can create a little bit of tension around, maybe not in my backyard kind of culture. Do you want to talk us through how you manage to get people housed in those situations and make it sustainable and in a way that's been successful?
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because when I was looking at your own website and looking at what you do, the biggest thing that struck me was the challenging community perceptions of homelessness. And that, to me, that really sticks out to me because that's what we're all about. It's communities don't typically know or understand homelessness unless it's affected them directly. And that's where we're trying to do a lot of work around that. But again, the individuals we're trying to house in Housing First, and we bring one of the fidelity elements is choice. So that if Peter is from Limerick City, for example, Peter wants to live in Limerick City. He's from the city. He's from that community. And it's about working with communities to actually talk to them about that, because they need to understand we're not trying to take people who aren't from your area and place them with you. We're trying to look after and help people who actually came from this community. And I think we've had good examples around the country in terms of that, where people have always known somebody who's been homeless and they've always looked at them and they pity them, but they never knew what to do in terms of supporting them. But for them to see the individual getting a house, getting a flat, and getting the opportunity to actually succeed, it's quite eye-opening and it's quite empowering as well. It's probably, it's more relevant in rural areas because rural areas are more, I think, about communities. Larger cities, you can be anonymous in a large city and nobody will know who you are. But in rural communities and rural villages, everybody knows your business. Everybody wants to know your business because they're trying to protect the community. So we do engage in the best possible way that we can with community groups. Community policing is a real part of what we try and engage as well, because it's a real kind of level breaker in the sense that, well, if the community police are involved in a project and are happy to talk to the person, engage with the person, support them, it must be okay. So that's a real part of gaining that actual trust within the community as well. But there are examples where community trust has been lost at the same time. And that happens. And that's about rebuilding relationships as well and working with communities. And at times it's a case of, well, the next tenant. So say if somebody was in trouble in a community and they were moved to a different flat, the next person that's moved in has to be carefully managed and carefully selected at the same time.
Yeah, and I guess also these issues, at least in in Australia from time to time can become a lot of pressure on the officers of local members of parliament, for example. They're like, we need this fixed, and it creates a lot of tension at times. So you're right, it needs to be managed very carefully and have good consultation with people.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just in terms of just any final thoughts around housing first and what it might look like, just for us to imagine what a typical housing first property might look like for someone. Let's say you're putting an individual into housing. Can it be in congregate living, or is it generally going to be an independent apartment or house how does it generally work? What might it look like?
Yeah, I suppose housing first is labeled across the world in different ways. And I suppose what we've taken a policy direction from, and again, it's been driven by government, that this is the policy that we try and follow the pathways model from the United States. Dr. Sam Simberis, who's the creator, the godfather, he wrote our manual in terms of training for housing first. And I suppose is working with us to keep the fidelity of it. So in that sense, we work on a scattered site housing basis. And then we don't, ultimately, if it's a block of units, we don't want more than 20% of that block to be housing first tenants either. So I suppose we try and keep it scattered site as best we can and low key. And I suppose from that perspective, congregate living, if you've got an apartment block, you share a corridor with somebody, that can add complications as well. So equally, for a lot of tenants, we try and look for own door accommodation, which is more difficult to find, but it can often be important in the sense that an individual and you've assessed that person and worked with them for a long time, and the type of accommodation that might suit them better. So I think that's important as well. And again, giving the tenant choice as well. Sometimes tenants might feel more secure when they're in an apartment block rather than having their own front door onto a street, for example. So there's a lot of different things that you have to take into account. We typically want to keep it to one bedrooms as well, because we have examples where properties have been overtaken by other individuals who, again, if you're taking somebody who's been rough sleeping for a long period of time, they meet people, their friends are equally rough sleeping, and they get their own property. The first thing that happens is, well, sure, can't I stay in your second bedroom, or can I do this and I do that? And again, we try and avoid that at all costs and work with people to rehouse them as well if we have issues where they've taken over a property. Again, it can often be just an accommodation choice issue. And again, rather than trying to be heavy-handed, it's about engaging whoever's done it as well, because they typically will have their own issues.
Rob, I'd just like to conclude with one final question, just a bit of context for our viewers. So Ireland is looking to build around 33,000 homes each year for the next 10 years, I think. So quite a significant build program across those different categories of housing. Some will be the rent build, some will be for affordable housing, some will be obviously normally priced market housing. It sounds like Housing First is making a terrific inroad into addressing rough sleeping across Ireland. What about the remaining homelessness cohorts, maybe some that aren't measured in terms of couch surfing and that? And I guess what's your thoughts as to the extent to which the Housing First model might be able to be taken up over the coming years to end, I guess, homelessness in Ireland?
Yeah, I suppose Housing First, as we ramp up, we're in terms of a target, we have a relatively small target up to 2026 of 1,319 properties. We think we're going to exceed that because demand is there to exceed it. But I suppose where we're focused on within Housing First is not just housing everybody in one-bed properties. It's about meeting the needs for those who have the complex issues, who have the dual diagnosis of addiction and mental health. Again, we're been accused of keeping our focus of Housing First narrow in terms of we're very much focused on that. But that's why we have successful outcomes as well. But as you said, we need that 30,000 units to be delivered every year, because that's what will really save us from the housing crisis. The focused work of Housing First will focus on people who are rough sleeping, who are in long-term homeless accommodation, and help them break their cycles as well. So I think that's where we're really focused on over the next number of years. And I think it's the wider social housing delivery that will save the general homelessness market between families and singles. But for the ones who really have the high support needs, Housing First is going to be there to help them and support them into the future as well.
Wonderful, Rob. Thank you. We're going to leave it there. I'd like to thank you so much for
No
joining our
problem at all. Thank
podcast
you.
today, bringing the really incredibly important work you're doing over there in Ireland to an Australian audience. Well, it's our pleasure to have you on the podcast, and we wish you every success with the work you're doing as part of the housing agency.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been really enjoyable, and equally, I wish you guys every success in your endeavors. And I think this is a great platform to be able to share thinking and share ideas.
Thank you, Rob. You've been watching or listening to Rob Lowth, who is the National Director of the Housing First National Office at the Housing Agency in the Republic of Ireland. Thank you for joining us on this podcast today. If you like the podcast, please like and subscribe to our channel so that we can get it out to more people. And until next time, bye for now.